Welcome to the August 2020 edition of this podcast. I've changed it from being only a blog so that you can get it on iTunes or another podcast app. Over time, I'll hope to get it on all of the different podcast apps. So my aim with this podcast is to bring PCP to people who want to learn more, but might be towards the beginner end of the spectrum of PCP users. So one of the things I want to do by making it into a podcast is to get people on and interview them about their use of PCP. So if you're one of those people who'd like to be interviewed, please do let me know. You can contact me at drawingtheidealself@icloud.com. Okay, so let's get on with today's show, which is about creativity and the birth, really, of Drawing the Ideal Self, which arose from quite a terrible situation in my practice as an educational psychologist. I've been thinking about creativity over the last few days, and I was thinking about why it matters to me. I listened to another podcast where somebody was talking about boredom. I think it was the All in the Mind Australia podcast. Quite an interesting one if you're interested in mental health. There's an equivalent programme in the UK, but it's not the same podcast as that one. Anyway, they were talking about boredom and how that can be important actually in stimulating creativity. In PCP, we always want to know what the contrast pole is to any construct because that tells us so much more about it. So I think my contrast pole to creativity is probably stifled. So I think of creativity as being about having ideas and experimenting, maybe adjusting other people's theories or ideas or adding on to them, or sometimes coming up with something entirely new. I'm very interested in the arts, and I think that's why. I think it's interesting to see people do something in a different way. I'm less interested in something like Shakespeare because it's been done so many times. And I think there are other ways of doing it. I'm probably more interested in rap than I am in Shakespeare, actually, from that point of view. Probably because one's more familiar than the other. Don't know anything about rap, really. But I think it's interesting that people have found a different way to communicate their ideas. And I see it as being like poetry. So the contrast for me is stifled, and I was thinking about what that is. So I think by being stifled, I would not know whether I could ever do something that's entirely my own, or I might feel restricted, so that there's only one area that I can focus on, and some things are sort of out of bounds. Or maybe I can only work, if I'm stifled, in reference to the past. So I could do something somebody else has done and replicate it. When I'm thinking about what to use in a session, I will try anything. I work out, for me, what seems to be the most sensible starting point. But then I'm aware there are other techniques I can drop in or experiment with or modify. And I think that's the beauty of PCP to me, that it's not one thing, it's many techniques. And not all techniques have already been designed. So, you might be somebody who's going to come up with your own and people will be using it for years to come. Hopefully that will happen. Tom Ravenette was really great on that. Harry Proctor's been fantastic. There's something called the Teshudy's ABC, which is about exploring what's holding them back from change, which is a really useful thing. And even something like the rating scales, the original version was called Salmon Lines. We use those all the time now, as if Kelly suggested that. So what Kelly was able to do was get people started. And I guess in some ways that's what I'm hoping to do with this podcast. I thought as an example, I would talk to you about how Drawing the Ideal Self came about. So at the time, I was an educational psychologist working in a local authority, in a city authority, and I was the psychologist for a primary school where in the last term of year 6 this lad Mark was referred. So he'd already had a diagnosis of dyslexia, and the concern wasn't really about that. It was about how he was going to manage at secondary school because his behaviour was difficult. The interesting thing was that he hadn't been referred sooner, and you might wonder why that might have been. But I think the school was saying, we anticipate there might be some problems with this boy when he goes up to secondary school. And they were right. So I did a little bit of work just getting to know him a bit and thinking about that and trying to get stuff in place ready for secondary school. His behaviour wasn't awful by any means. So he was a bit of a rogue and got into trouble, caused some problems on the playground, didn't listen well in class, wasn't very interested in his work. The dyslexia made that a bit harder for him, but it wasn't really the reason that he wasn't doing what he should do. He didn't find it interesting. So he went up to year 7 of a very large academic secondary school, and I worked with the school to design something to support his behaviour. Now this was during the time, I think it was before I'd started my PCP advanced course. So I wasn't experienced in PCP at that point. I was really a beginner and very keen, but I didn't really know that much about it. So I set up a nice behaviour programme based on rewards, some sanctions, but not really many. But it's mainly a reward-based programme to encourage him to do what he should do. And it worked really well. The next school year, so in year 8 now, he was referred again for exactly the same problems. And foolishly, I did exactly the same thing. We set up a really nice behaviour programme. That was working. As soon as I pulled out, it started to go a bit ropey, so I got involved again and we did some reviews, and then everything was going okay again. But what was clear when he came into year 9 was the same thing had happened. So while he was being closely monitored and people were keeping an eye on him and giving him the rewards that were agreed, his behaviour improved. When that structure was taken away from him, he didn't actually want to improve his behaviour, particularly himself, so he didn't seem to have internalised why it might be a good idea to behave better and avoid being in trouble at school. So in year 9, his school were really getting fed up with him. He wasn't doing anything awful, which was interesting. They had a very strict dress code, and one of the things he did repeatedly, which caused a load of problem for them, was to wear a sweatshirt with a really small Nike tick on it. So the school uniform was a black sweatshirt. His black sweatshirt wasn't the correct one. And for some of the way the school was organised, this was a big deal. He also would be disruptive in lessons, mess about, not anything awful, but just make it hard for the teacher to teach. And the school were fed up with that because they're a very academic school and it was expected that students behave themselves so that the teaching could carry on. So he didn't really fit in that environment. And in year 9, they'd had enough and they called a meeting and felt that he was not well placed in their school. The meeting in school had a lot of people around the table, including the special needs coordinator, his year head, his PE teacher, his parents, a specialist teacher for dyslexia, someone from the local authority because they were looking at a decision about whether to start a formal assessment, and me. And the whole idea was to come up with a better plan. The uniform issue did really matter to the school because it came to represent his disregard and flouting of rules, so that he would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He would go to places in the school that you weren't supposed to be in during lessons. He would be messing about on the field or not be in at the right time when the bell rang. So there were lots of small things, and actually that Nike tick and the wearing of a sweatshirt so openly meant that the school felt that he was showing them that he didn't care about the school, and therefore they weren't sure it was the right place for him. They gave a catalogue of behaviour problems that he had, and we knew what they were because we'd seen them all before. So definitely he was disruptive in lessons, he was difficult when he was challenged, He would respond to teachers who were telling him off by laughing and messing about and making jokes, and then other kids in the class would join in. And what they felt he needed was to move to a special school. So they wanted him in an environment which would be what they termed as more suited to his needs. They were very clear that if this didn't turn up anything that seemed reasonable, they would be pushing for this lad to be out of the school. He wasn't present at the meeting, which nowadays he might have been at that age, but this was kind of early 1990s. So I had my 3 sessions, and the first 2 were as usual, and we had a really nice chat. He was a very affable kid who was friendly, enjoyed adult contact, made conversation easily, didn't have any problems with talking, could reflect on his behaviour, could talk about why he did things, which was mainly to do with being bored or not being interested. It turned up nothing new at all. So after those 2 sessions, I'd got 1 left, and I really felt like my back was against the wall. So I was very conscious of having to go into that meeting and say, well, I haven't been able to find out anything new. There's nothing different that I can suggest. Fortunately for me, I was already on the PCP course by then, and I had been thinking a lot about trying to do things in a different way. So in that 3rd session, when my back really was against the wall, somehow we managed to come up with drawing the ideal self. Now, one of the reasons for doing it was to stop him talking, because he could talk for England, and actually using the drawings was helpful. So getting him to pause, think was very important, and without the drawings he didn't do that. Drawing the Ideal Self version 1 came out of that conversation. So we talked and he drew, and I kept control of the pen in order to facilitate his attention on the task. It turns out that was a really useful part, and I always do that wherever possible so that I can pace the task. So we went back to the meeting, and I really had nothing to say from my first 2 sessions, but from my 3rd session I was able to show them his drawings and explain his views, and he drew some interesting things. So his ideal person was really what you might describe as a wide boy. It was a young guy driving his car down the road on his mobile phone, and at the time mobile phones were pretty big, so it was drawn nice and big. He was driving along in this lovely car and wearing cool clothes on the phone, all the latest gadgets in his car, and he was admired for all of those things, but he also had a job and went to work. Now that was interesting because I hadn't specified anything about school or work or any of that, but that came up. So his non-ideal self was definitely a boy in school. His ideal self was a young guy out in the town enjoying himself and also contributing usefully through going to work and doing the things that people expected people to do. What was very clear from doing those drawings was how important clothing was to him and what it symbolised. And that was interesting because it was also very important to the school because of what it symbolised. So to him, it demonstrated that he was more than a schoolboy. He had the potential to be somebody else. And the teachers in the meeting were very interested in this, and suddenly they could understand that actually him wearing a black sweatshirt which only had a tiny Nike tick was not really what he wanted to wear. You know, he would have preferred to come in with a massive Nike across his chest, wearing the wrong trousers, you know, having picked his own cool things, wearing not the school shoes but some very cool trainers. And they could see for the first time, I think, that he was compromising. Whereas before that, they'd seen him as trying to find ways to deliberately flout their rules and make them look stupid. This sort of new understanding of this lad led to the adults around him volunteering to do particular things with him. So his parents decided that they would put in some extra incentives at home for him towing the line at school. So if he didn't get into trouble, they would give him something. And that was going to be money that was related to what he could buy with that money. So it wasn't just going to be cash, it was going to be money towards things that he wanted, mainly going to be clothes. Now that was their suggestion because they could see that that really mattered to him. And they were very keen because he'd only got 2 years to go and they valued the school, that he should stay there if he could. So they were willing to put in some extra cash in order to make that happen. His PE teacher was also at the meeting because this lad was quite good at sport and he volunteered to mentor him. So he's going to meet with him every Friday, have a chat, not necessarily do anything much, but talk with him and try and build a relationship with him. He quite liked the lad and could get on with him anyway. So that seemed better than the year head doing it, who had previously been the person involved. Special needs coordinator did know him, but that had always been focused on all of his difficulties. And it was felt that the PE teacher, if he had a go, that he might be able to build a relationship, which might mean he could say to him, don't do this or do more of that. Those things seemed to actually work, and we set up another meeting where this same lad was seen completely differently. So he and the PE teacher were getting on really well. They were having a few jokes together. They were meeting every week. It wasn't a problem kind of meeting, and the PE teacher was definitely making a relationship with him. And the lad was responding to being told in a different kind of way. He was getting on with his work better. He was not causing any problems and not getting sent to the year head. And it seemed that if the year head had contact with him, he'd got a different style of relating to him now, where he was also a bit more jokey and talked to him about the things he did outside school, as well as times when he discussed how he was getting on in his lessons. His parents had put in this reward towards getting new clothes. That was going well. So I didn't see him again after that. And that was interesting because it was quite an unexpected result for it to be so successful. And I know that it persisted because I was going into the school regularly and they weren't raising him as a concern with me. And if I asked about him, they said he was okay. I was surprised that the problems seemed to have been resolved so well. And I kept thinking he was going to come back. He didn't. And interestingly, when he was about 17, 18, he'd left the school and he'd got an apprenticeship and he was going to work every day, and he started going out with the girl who was related to somebody that I was working with. And he sent me a message. The message was to say thank you for helping him when he was in school. And he said that piece of work that we did, he didn't call it that, but he said that had changed everything for him. And that saved him in that school. And he wanted me to know that and to say thank you. I was astounded. One, that it had worked so well in the first place, but also that he knew how close he had been to not being at the school. And he could see that the thing that had made a difference was something that happened in that piece of work. And I'm sure it was his teachers understanding him as a person, seeing him as somebody who had a life outside of school, somebody who had different ambitions, somebody they could relate to and identify with, instead of this alien child who was trying to mess up their system. As well as changing things for him, that really changed things for me. I started using Drawing the Ideal Self with other young people, and younger children too, and it seemed to work pretty well. For the young person as well, they said they felt comfortable with how they had illustrated themselves. So I'd always check at the end of using the technique about whether they thought it represented them okay, and they always said yes. And I thought that was a very valid reason for continuing. And in every case, I shared the pictures with the adults around them, so their parents or carers and their teachers, and people found it helpful. So I did a presentation about it in Birmingham at a personal construct psychology interest group that we used to run at the university. And somebody picked it up from there and told somebody else. And then I had a contact a few months later from someone who was going to use it with teaching assistants to show them how they could explore young people's views. And that got me thinking that really I should probably write it up. And that's how it came to be written. I thought maybe I want to say how I think it should be used and my own illustration of it, so that if people want to teach other people, they've got something they can use and refer to as well. So I did that, and even though the work didn't fit easily into a journal, it was accepted for publication. And then people have picked it up and tried it since, and I've published other things to do with it. But it all came from that one day with that boy when I was in a stuck situation and I really didn't know what to do. I was at risk of being invalidated as a psychologist because we're supposed to be able to come up with things. And I've just reread Tom Ravenette's paper, Never, Never Give Advice. And I think that's really interesting to look at because his focus was on understanding people, helping other people to understand people, but letting them come up with their own advice. And Tom was my supervisor for the PCP course, and he definitely challenged me in all kinds of ways to think about what I was doing and to avoid being somebody who told other people what to do. And his argument for not giving advice was that people would not be asking for it at the point that it was given, and that it emphasised a kind of one up, one down situation in terms of a dynamic. And it's made me think about that as well. And I've found young people do have a view on themselves and do have theories about how they've become the person that they are. And I think that we should listen to them, because if we're going to help them, we need to understand where they're coming from. So I'm telling you this really so that you can be encouraged to have a go and try things for yourself. And if you do something that works out well for you in one case, think about whether you can apply it to the next child and try it out for another one and see if it turns into something that you could then write up as a technique. And remember that Kelly didn't say, here are all the techniques, this is what you can use. PCP is very open to new things, and people develop techniques and they get passed around. And I think because there is a community spirit within the PCP world of sharing things for as little cost as possible, they do get passed on. We don't tend to run heavy, expensive training courses to teach people about the techniques that we have. So please, if you find Drawing the Ideal Self useful in any way, please do tell people, pass it on. Tell them to go to the website, ideally, because then they'll get notifications of anything else that comes up. However, you don't have to do that. You can just give them the piece of paper you've printed out yourself. So, I would like to know who they are, but if the choice is not knowing, I'd rather people could find a technique that they might be able to help a young person with and maybe stop somebody ending up in a right mess. So, that's today's podcast. Next time, I'm not really sure what I'm going to be doing, but by the time it happens, I'll know. So, this has been August version. I'll see you again in September. Have a good month.